Everybody. Welcome to our very special evening tonight. My name is Jacqueline Callahan. I'm the co-owner of the Golden Notebook Bookstore in Woodstock, and I'm so thrilled to be part of this wonderful series that's sponsored by the Woodstock Byrdcliffe Guild, and it's their book talks, author forums, and it's featuring Woodstock authors, poets, and writers. And today, actually, we're going to have another writer do the moderation today. His name is Bennet Ratcliff, and he is a local angler and a writer. And he's going to be introducing our very special author and guest today, and he'll be moderating the discussion. And later on, after the reading and discussion, you could put your questions in the chat. So I'm going to introduce Bennet Ratcliff.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. I greatly appreciate it. And it is such an honor to be here, able to introduce Nick Lyons. I mean, if you have ever read any of Nick's articles or his books, or if you have read something that he has edited, or perhaps one of the dozens or hundreds of books that he has published, you will know that he is a connoisseur. He is an epicure. He is a raconteur par excellence, and I can't say anything more than welcome Nick Lyons.
I'm delighted to be here, Bennett. Am I coming through? I don't. I'm very frightened of machines like this.
I think we hear you really well. Go right ahead. I was hoping that we could begin with perhaps you're reading something from your new work, Fire in the Straw, Notes on Inventing a Life. And if you haven't seen it, this is it, everybody. It's
fine, Bennett. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Let me talk a little bit about the book first, and then there'll be a place to put the readings, a place to slot them in, so you know what's happening. It's a book written in my late 80s that really tries to collect and cobble together a great number of different parts of my life, starting very early when I'm about 5 years old and go to I'm put in a boarding school under rather scary conditions, and it was a rather scary place. And it follows me through years of struggling to change what I think was a very, very useless childhood. I've read many wonderful childhood books, and I love them, but mine was not that. It was dull, wearying. I had a stepfather who had a thumb on me a lot of the time. I was a little young for my age because I had started the first grade earlier, and short and small for my age. I wanted to be an athlete, and eventually went to the University of Pennsylvania, pretty much under the thumb of my stepfather, and studied insurance, which was about the dullest possible 4 years I've ever spent in my life. Happily, I was playing basketball for the University of Pennsylvania team, and that really is what held me in the college. But when I got out, I went into the Army, and suddenly I had a degree in insurance with mostly D's and C's. I was a very desultory student in those days. And in the Army, I began to read randomly at first, everything I could find, and did not quite make a commitment with what to do with it, but it was compelling. I was wandering around everything from Mickey Spillane to Franz Kafka, and I didn't know where I was or where I was going to come out. When I got out of the Army, I left my home and lived in a tiny little room. Couldn't have been more than 8 feet by 12 feet, I think. Small, dreary, in a brownstone down in Greenwich Village. And I was determined somehow not to come out of that room until I figured out what I wanted to do. I had one remarkable teacher. Um, Later, people called him a fraud, but to me, he was an exciting teacher. And frauds can be exciting teachers sometimes. Um, at the end of the course, it was in English prose style. He was going down the hallway, and I was very shy. I talked to practically no one. I didn't know what to say to them about literary matters, but I crept up to Keith Botsford was his name, and I said to him, can I make the team virtually? Can I get on this team, this literary team? And he looked at me for a moment. He said, Nick, he says, you're not dumb. You're just totally illiterate. And I took it as a great compliment at the time. Being dumb seemed to me a more a permanent state of being. And I was happy to hear that I had some chance of pulling out of it if I could do that thing called getting literate. I went back to college as a freshman. I'm going to not go all the way with this, but I just want to get a certain distance. As a freshman at Bard College, and I thought totally of going through the entire four-year program and starting again, reading literature, which I was getting more and more excited by. When I found somebody I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with, and did, spent 58 remarkable years with her. Someone at Bard, a senior, a painter by the name of Mary Blumenau then. And we took off to Michigan, where she had a scholarship to the Cranbrook Academy. I managed to squeeze myself into the MA program after being given Rorschach tests to see if I was crazy or not, and a variety of tests. I had to take a full 6 months and get full A's out of it for it before he'd let me in. At any rate, I got in, I got the PhD, and then went to New York, and another series of problems came up. I taught at Michigan, I became a teacher, and then the years in between were really holding on to this flame that I'd caught. I think of the title of the book, Fire in the Straw, as being the fire everybody has in them to pursue their passion, to find out what it is and what needs to be done to bring it forth out of the straw. The quote comes from an old document from the 15th century by a man named Thomas Lodge that goes, "The lion cannot hide his claws, fire cannot be hid in the straw, but at last it will have its course, it will come out." And then the two things I'm going to read are things that occurred during the years between my having gotten a doctorate, become a teacher, after that an editor at the same time, simultaneously. I had myself put into the night session so I could work in the publishing world during the day. Eventually, I was able to found a little publishing house of my own that I ran for some years. It was quite successful. Did books that I'm very proud of. Some Nobel Prize winners on the list, and then sold it. And in the last years of my life, have mostly written and tried to make myself slightly better in the world. At any rate, when I lived in the small place and small apartment, I began to send things out into the world, and I was rejected wholesale. Everybody rejected them. It was not until actually the years we began to spend in Woodstock during the summer that I first became what I would call a writer and was willing to commit myself to it. I'm going to read first a section on those summers in Woodstock from a chapter called Some Woodstock Summers. And they were very important to me. And I think it's appropriate since Woodstock is really dominating this little book that I read some sections. Peter Whitehead, who was the son of the original Whitehead that founded Byrdcliffe, Peter Whitehead charged us $300 from the time the crocuses came up to when it got too cold for the pot-bellied stove to warm our toes. At night, raccoons scratched at the garbage cans, and our sleep was rattled by the snap and plunk of the mouse traps we had to set along the 2x4-inch raw rafters 8 feet up. The traps bounced down when they tripped. The place was lousy with mice. I baited the traps with peanut butter and killed dozens of them that first summer with impunity. Mary painted. I wrote critical essays, which I placed with half a dozen literary magazines. The children ran amok like the mice. Marlon Brando passed us on his motorcycle on the thruway. I fed the raccoon, and it mistook my finger for a hot dog. We watched Dylan and Baez ride back and forth on Tinker Street on their motorcycles, buoyantly young, the world poised to embrace them. Del Rayleigh, Tina Bromberg, and some of the Malkeen children, it often took 2 or more to handle our 4, helped with our kids. We kept warm with slab wood we bought from a young farmer who gave us 4 ducklings. With the colossal stupidity of a city boy, I thought young ducks could surely like to swim and put them in a full bathtub. For what was their last swim, alas. I leaned toward moving water whenever we drove past the Sawkill or Esopus, and bolted from Byrdcliffe to fish whenever I could. I should add that one of the things I learned at the little boarding school was fishing, which became, I was 6 years old, I became passionate about the mysteries of the water, the pleasure of watching a bobber go up and down, the excitement and suspense of it all, and eventually wrote a great deal about it and built upon it my own. The essays I had published were about Kafka, Thomas Nash, Chrétien de Troyes, St. Augustine, Tolstoy, Melville, a real stew, but they all bore the faint stink of graduate school. My dissertation on Jones Very, a minor American poet who thought everything he wrote was dictated by the Holy Spirit, which led Emerson to say, when Emerson edited his books, "Cannot the Spirit parse and spell?" Perhaps the only witticism that austere man ever uttered. Book was published by Rutgers University Press, and I had seen a dozen of my poems find homes in literary quarterlies and in the New York Times, which published poems at that time. Somehow, none of it counted. I was restless. I still got every story and poem rejected from serious magazines across the country and kept filling shoeboxes I had kept from my lonely days in that tiny room. Manny Bromberg had introduced me to Jim Mulligan, who drew cartoons for the New Yorker, and Jim began to talk of a mythic friend, Frank Maley, a violist and remarkable fly fisherman, apparently. A proposed fishing trip kept being postponed on slim grounds, and that managed to triple the mystery of the man. I finally set off with Frank and Jim to the Beaverkill River, Mecca for fly fishers, Frank called it. He was a gaunt man with dark, old, blinking eyes, stunning pronouncements, Delphic and hilarious, and with all the pit stops for beer and the Delphic pronouncements, the hour-and-a-half trip took 9 hours. We finally got to the Beaverkill. I could barely stand, let alone pitch a fly. Frank promptly caught 2 large trout, Jim and I nothing. The day was so pungent, unique, unforgettable, hilarious, that I promptly sat down at my old Underwood standard, and the story wrote itself in one sitting. Somewhere in the writing of that shaggy fishtail about that long circus of a trip, I felt a new voice percolating inside me, far from the academic cant I had learned too well in graduate school, and also from the pretentious, stilted, overwrought prose I had written and thought that this was literature. I sent it right into the world then, finished a little story about a big trout I had gigged in a creek up in the Catskills, where my grandfather owned a hotel. In these stories, especially the second, about gigging a little trout from that creek, I found a voice that was earthy, nimble, wry, full of wit and worms and celebration, free from the pretension, from the preaching and analyzing all that was fancy down or trendy. That second story had in it the mud of the creek and the point of the long shank hook with which I gigged that trout. I had lain on the weathered boards of an old bridge, watched a dimpling sunfish, seen the nose of a great spotted trout protruding from under the base of the bridge, tried for it without success, and then eased the hook, strapped to an alder branch, into its mouth, and yanked. In a week, I got back a one-sentence note from the editor of Field and Stream, advising me in his own hand. I had thought by this time that editors had forgotten how to write. They only sent these little slips at the time. The note said, "We like Mecca," which was the first story I sent out, "and a check for $1,000 will go out to you next week." I nearly peed in my pants. A few weeks later, just after we had returned to the city, the other was accepted too. I sent them to my friend Emil Capuya, then publisher of Funk and Wagnalls, and he urged me to write a book in the vein of the two stories, as he called it, a melange of poetry and technology. I wrote The Seasonable Angler. It was published by Funk and Wagnalls, and over the next years I wrote 7 or 8 more, some with illustrations by Mary on the jacket and in the interior. And what fun it all was. The stories and books were miles from the literature I had found late in my young life and had begun to teach with such passion. But they were my own and were the beginning of something important in my life. I wrote Austin Warren, the great scholar with whom I had studied in graduate school, about them and proudly sent him The Seasonable Angler. But he advised me in very stern terms that I must at once abandon all this piffle about trout and attend to my academic duties, my true career, which he had prepared me for. Sadly, I wrote him an intemperate letter that I have long and painfully regretted, telling him that I rather liked trout and thought mayflies, especially Ephemera gutulata, the green drake, were not piffle, and that I felt immensely comfortable with the romp of these stories I had found that last long summer in Woodstock, and was proud of this new direction my thinking had taken. And then the city demanding more and more attention, lest it devour me. We had 4 children by then. I took a second and then a third full-time job and tried by hook or by crook to keep on those tracks I had laid during those Catskill summers until we could circle back to Woodstock much later, which I did. I think Woodstock had that kind of importance to us. One thing that happened was that Mary saw her first art teacher who was living in Woodstock, Fletcher Martin, who lived on Meads Mountain Road. Eventually, we bought that house. We bought Fletcher's house. He had a rather small studio, perfectly good size for most people, but Mary painted gigantic canvases, and we expanded it from 1,000 to 2,500 square feet, which she enjoyed immensely and did the best work of her life. Eventually, I built myself a little pond since I like water, and not as a symbol, but as a thing in itself. It seemed to reflect things about my life that am I going on too long? No. Things about my life that I felt strongly about. One was the issue of survival, how I had survived under some very difficult circumstances, and was coming to an age when I had a different kind of joy, not responsible for jobs, not responsible for money anymore, and was able to write full-time whenever I liked. And Mary had that pleasure of painting whenever she liked, which was all the time. She was an everyday painter and did an immense amount of work. I dug the pond, and everybody told me it was a lousy pond. They said that it would get excess water from the road runoff, which had grease and all sorts of some poisons in it, that it will not hold the water, it would lose the water, which I was beginning to do. It had fish that I had stocked it with, some of which survived decently, the koi and the gigantic carp, grass carp. The trout lasted for 2 seasons and then died off. I don't blame them for getting out of there. Turtles came and went. And in the end, I began to think of it more and more as a kind of symbol, something that I had done because I loved building a pond for myself. I always wanted one, but it seemed to reflect more and more of my life, of this process of survival.
So Nick, there's a question here that I think if you could pause just a moment, which really asks just about that. It's from Rob Wilson. Thanks, Rob. And it says, water is obviously a crucial material and poetic element to your life via fishing. What about the fire in the straw as your key metaphor and element? Is fire passion, light, and heal, or something more mystical in your quest for being reborn as a writer and teacher of literature?
Certainly a good question. I do have a chapter on a fire that we had that decimated everything we owned about 4 years into our marriage. We had the 4 children, and they managed to survive. A dog that had been given us by one of the Woodstock residents, a lovely collie, was caught in the fire. It was a monstrous thing. But the fire I have in the title is really a simple symbol of a fire that is a passion inside each of us. I had a good dose of it, a real dose of it when I was about 25. It had been very dormant before then. But when it began to come through the straw, I kept feeding it, and it became a very big fire indeed. I could read all night, I would write all night. In years when I was doing some ghostwriting as well as other writing, the kids would go to sleep with the sound of the typewriter, and they'd wake up with the sound of the typewriter. I just would write a complete book in 5.5 weeks with 2 other jobs full time. And I don't know how I did it. I must have had some great energy then. But the fire is the passion that you put extra time in on. You fan it, you make it grow, and you make what the fire is define you, as it defined me, which was writing. And ultimately, that's where I wanted to go and where I did go.
Nick, is it also correct? Did I read that when the fire destroyed everything in your house, that your first novel was also destroyed, and that the working title for it was Fire in the Straw?
Correct. That's absolutely so, Bennett. It was the first clumsy beginnings to this book. It was happily destroyed. It was an awful book. It was a dreadful novel. If anyone had published it, I would have been regretting it all my life.
Not to be confused with this Fire in the Straw, which is spectacular, I have to say. I was at times crying. There are so many tragic, poignant moments, and then at times it is hilarious. It is just riotous. I mean, you're excellent in the way that you can bring these two things out. Could you read another passage, please?
I will indeed. I thank you for being such a good reader. Several people have said, well, I guess you got that off your brain, Nick, before you died, as if it was all the sad things. It's not. I think it's very funny. And I think the sad things were part of a life. I never viewed them then. And there is no crybaby in any of this. And there's no attempt to say, this is how awful it was for me. I worked hard. It was a life, and I loved it. I was tired at times, but I thought it was all part of a life that I had chosen and wanted to live. At any rate, with this pond, my wife once said something about her paintings that she said, I never paint symbolically. She said, some things are automatically symbolic. She painted some fallen trees a lot, and someone asked her if they were symbolic of something. She said, no, they're fallen trees. But if you look at a fallen tree, or the skulls that she often painted, or this pond that I'm talking about, it somehow reflected, without my really thinking it, became something symbolic. I did not make it that way. The pond still doesn't hold water any better than I can. And after a gully washer, it's often the color of coffee flushed with milk. Even low and distressed, it is never even faintly clear. But now, in its 16th year, it is still alive and holds a stew of vigorous denizens, one plump bass, far too many hungry, stunted bluegill, the two bright koi, 4 orange orfs, which is a Russian fish, sawbellies galore, and the gigantic triploid grass carp, now black, magisterial, ugly, slow. The miracle is that something has survived in this unpromising waters. I like to sit on the dock in the heavy dusk and toss food pellets, or pieces of bread to who will have them. Sometimes I think of Nat Ress, who was my father, who died before he was born and really set in motion a lot of my life. Rose, my mother, Arthur, my stepfather, or Amy, my stepsister, my half-sister, and a fire, and classrooms and offices, and books, and the tiny snot green room in Greenwich Village. And sometimes I think of Ice Pond, which I first fished more than 3/4 of a century ago. A close friend or two, and fish in the murky waters of the past. And always now, I think of Mary and Paul. Mary died several years ago, a few months after our 58th birth anniversary. She had given me life. She had been my life. We had loved with passion, sometimes fought when something said about something said in the heat of then, shared without reserve. I think of dumb arguments, flashes of anger, how I could not sleep except beside her, how we laughed and worked and loved and did not mind silences and finished each other's sentences or did not need to do so. There was a banter that found us, now is gone. The night of her last exhibition in Chelsea, she felt excruciating pain in her right femur. We thought it was orthopedic. She could barely walk. The MRI showed that her old breast cancer had wandered to her bone, and that led to a painful operation, some months of wild hopes, 6 months of radiation and physical therapy, some moments of genuine hope, and then a horrible decline. She died in April, and I was devastated. Nearly 2 years later, I was driving on the on the River Road after dropping Charlie at the Byrdcliffe station, and suddenly could not breathe. I stopped abruptly on the side, on the shoulder, put my head in my hands, shouted like a trapped animal, and began to cry bitterly. I had barely cried since my days at the boarding school. I must have stayed that way for half an hour, weeping. And then 2 years almost to the day of Mary's death, Paul died of the melanoma he had fought for a dozen years. He had been a prominent professor at the University of Hawaii who loved the sun very much, too much. Both had died when the forsythia was golden at the transverse I covered every day to see each in the hospital. Only the French word arrachement comes to mind when I think of them. A raw ripping away like that of a tree torn by a storm, leaving a gaping hole. I read and remember less, perhaps understand a bit more. Mostly these past years, I have tried to cobble together bits of my fractured days, looking for hints of a pattern, the arc of it. I have tried to find a few of its meanings, make some order out of the disparate days. For my memory, which buoyed me for so many years after I found it, has been slipping downstream, vanishing. Names, whole passages of favorite prose and poetry, now only vaguely in my head, in pieces. Books read, even their titles forgotten. Words said in a classroom, vaporize. We write, says the Hungarian writer Sander Marai, what we have to lose. And I'm probably trying to hold back whatever I have to lose. The dramatic change when I chose life, all the shaggy fishtails I wrote, the start of a family, the years in classrooms and offices, books I published by others, my wife and children. Memories fugitive, capricious. I remember what I can, prompted by a sight, a photograph, a word, a smell. I am flooded with questions I cannot answer. Whether my whole life was set on iron rails that raw March night before I was born, when a young husband developed pneumonia and a few days later died. And if so, whether his good heart killed him, or something my mother said, or thought she said, or carelessness, or a belief in the invincibility of youth, or bad chance. And what difference does it make for me now? Surely my mother, in all her shock and grief and guilt, never imagined, traveling her lonely road, surrounded by so many who did not love her, and surely sent ripples in motion in my life. Ripple after widening ripple, all many years ago. And when those ripples played out, others began, until those too vanished. Or was it the beginning in that little room where I first shook my life by the throat and sought whatever I could find, blindly, only vaguely suspected? Was the life already crouched inside me, like the heart of a bulb? Or was it merely newly built of air? There were quickenings. I'm going to skip a little bit. Tonight, in the heavy evening dusk, I take a long look at our huge living room and dining room before I head yet again to the pond. Once, many years ago, on the River Road, this is the road that leads from Bard College down to the Rhinecliff station. We faintly imagined such a house as this. Paintings leaning against chairs and tables, even covering bookcases, and books everywhere. Endless numbers and configurations of books piled on chairs, benches, tables, cramming every bookshelf, on the floor, in the bathrooms, in the large book-lined office, my office, on the floor, in the in unopened boxes from used books dealers, books glanced at, considered, read slowly, and the happy mix of things bought by Mary, who loved things, at rummage sales or bazaars, a few at a local auction, scores of ceramics, a rampant wooden horse, candelabras, African masks, and an African spoon man, a grandfather clock that still keeps fair time, Indian statuettes, posters by Clay, Matisse, Picasso, a little stone Metzen man Mary bought in her teens, which we placed on a mantelpiece whenever we moved. Mostly books and paintings, and a slew of children and grandchildren visiting, all always a bit older, and always memories of a woman who stayed the course with this old mumbler for 58 years, through great passion and ice, and some shouting, and a mountain of love, and who followed her own destiny with intrepid persistence. She was here, and she is gone, and Paul is gone, and their absences are raw and pungent, and their memories precious. Everything in its placement shouts her presence, and every day still more books arrive, and every day messages from the children, and sometimes from their children, who will soon have their own lives to fashion. Sometimes I look at an old photograph on my desk of our children when they were perhaps 6 to 10, and sometimes I see glimmers there of who they became. Sometimes I look closely at a photograph taken at a nearby hotel, big one in New Paltz, some years ago on our 50th anniversary. There were 15 of us, mostly looking in different directions. Ah, the great mulch of it, the textured stew. How much richer and fuller a life than we figured. Oh dear.
Nick, it's just beautiful. I mean, it's simply just, it's gorgeous. I just have to ask. It's like I'm like crying and laughing and smiling and wiping tears. Is that going on while you're writing this too? I mean,
Absolutely, Bennett. It, the most serious things, one of the ways we get through the serious ones is by making them hilarious, if we can. And part of what hilarious means is that we've got to be a good deal more serious. Otherwise, we're just going to be clowns. Let me finish this thing quickly. I'm almost done. Tonight, I lumbered back from the pond, a bear of a man, garrulous, bearded, often impatient with myself, walking with a rolling gait and a cane and titanium hips and too much belly. A great athlete I once played basketball with remembers me as a skinny little kid from Brooklyn who could run all day. He was there, and I am here. I barely know that boy anymore and don't much miss him. I pass Mary's studio and see her starting a new, very large canvas with an image of a carousel horse. In the darkened glass of the studio, suddenly mirror-like, I catch a glimpse of an old fellow with a beard and uncombed hair. He looks like a little like a badly tied track fly, but not someone who once thought he had no life. I smile. I cannot find any of that devastating self-knowledge that Gabriel finds in the mirror of Joyce's story. Terrible moment in Joyce's story, The Dead, in which he looks at himself and sees a fatuous fool that he is, orating to barbarians. I see a runneled face, an aging man, still in love with words and a handful of people, and still with much work to do, important to him. The old fire I found in me that sustained me is banked low, but the orange coals are bright. There is a noise below me in the sloping field, a whirring of wings. It is merely a flock of crows from the high, rising from the high grasses, making the air tremulous in their departure. Like all those years of fear and doubt and striving, of joy and love, rising, fluttering, and then in a crazy crowd, gone. I'm happy to talk now. Damn Bennett. Did I go on too long? Not too bad.
No, not at all. This is fantastic. And I guess I would just say that you're certainly not the fatuous fool, but I'm sure that there's some of the rabble here. We may have some questions. So if anybody's got questions, please, you can put them in the chat there. You know, do you have time for a couple of questions, Nick?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Excellent.
I'd love to.
Anybody have a question that they'd like to ask?
I can talk more if there are no questions. I've become a very garrulous old man. From a shy kid, I have got the word in my head now, and I don't need to stop. But
while people are thinking and typing in questions, let me ask, where did you live in Byrdcliffe? Do you remember which of the places you were in?
I don't remember the first, but the second was called the Studios. It was a long railroad route of rooms, all with skylights in them, and that's the one that had these rafters up about 8 feet high, and the mice would run along the rafters, and they were just. I don't like to kill creatures, but the mice got the worst of me. And we enjoyed Byrdcliffe very much. We had some lovely babysitters, many of whom are the Malkeens are still here. Gil is a hilarious comic, and we had great joy in those years. I think that Woodstock was always a place we wanted to come back to. We had first come here when we were at Bard together. I had an old 46 Ford convertible, and we drove over from the bridge had just opened, I think, and we came over from Bard, and many times, and looked at Woodstock and liked it. And then when finally my business was sold and my life was settling down, we were in a position to buy something. I took we went around and had some rather strange visits to houses that were billed as potential Shangri-Las that would have taken about $1 million to make them into that. And we circled into Woodstock. We looked several times. Bill Cronenberg, who I had known and who was a fisherman, was also a teacher, was then serving as a real estate agent. And he looked and had a number of things that didn't appeal to us. And then I told him, we very much liked Fletcher's house. Is anyone in it now? There wasn't a sign in front of it. And he said he'd keep an eye out for it. About 3 months later, he heard that the woman living in it, who was a realtor herself, had put it up for sale. And wasn't very long thereafter that we had a closing, took it over, and we're just ecstatic. It was the first house that either of the two of us had as in our marriage, and we just first looked at the studio, since Mary's painting was always so important to me, and decided that Fletcher's studio, in which many great poker games had taken place, I think maybe Fletcher's reputation went down because of that. But we decided to do a major extension of it, and added 1,400 square feet, which was a great joy. But
I see we've got some.
it's very special.
I see we've got some questions here. I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Here's one. It's was the title of the lost novel "Air in the Straw" another element of the breath and soul, the same straw image now with fire in the straw?
No, it was always fire.
Got it. Okay.
Another one was an attempt to do what finally happened here in my 86th or 87th year, cobbling together the various parts and not going into a full-fledged autobiography, which I think would have been a mistake. Most of anyone's life is reasonably dull. My son Charlie is reading the Obama autobiography, and it's not dull. He had a very full life. I had a lot of great things happen that aren't in this book. A lot of great joy with my children.
Here's another question. It says from Owen Smith. It says, Nick, I was so moved by your account of your life as a young boy. I wonder whether you can speak of what it was like for you to become and be a father, given the pain you had experienced, being fatherless and having had the stepfather that you had.
Yes, very good question. I can't really talk a little bit about those middle years from 8 to 21 or 22 when I went away, but I was thrilled with my first, second, third, and fourth children. They came within 5 years, all 4 of them, to visit, and I love them very deeply. And right from the beginning, they were, as I put in the dedication, they gave me a life. And the only regret I have is that they were too many too quickly, perhaps, so that I didn't get to spend much time with any of them, with all the busyness of New York than I wanted to. But they were a great joy to me. I have pictures of them all over this room. One of me and Charles, one which I love, another of all 4 children at in Central Park and the like. It's funny how some people who have had a bad childhood are sour for most of their life. I was just the opposite. They were the making of a life, and it was just a dull middle years to me.
Here's a good one from Edward Lyons. It says, Nick, do you ever feel that you fished too much or not enough? Thank you for sharing and reading.
Also a wonderful question. I always worried that I was fishing too much. With a busy family, it's hard to break away and come back and leave a wife with 4 children. You don't have to be a feminist to think that that's a pretty lousy deal at times. But I tried to work it in some way where at least a couple of them came with me a lot of the time. In the years when they were young, clearly I fished less than I wanted to. I never felt quite that I had fished myself out, aufgefischen, if there's such a word. But I can remember a few nights when I had wonderful fishing in Montana, and Mary was painting on the bank. And one time I came out just in the middle of a terrific hatch of flies with trout rising all over the place. Um, and she said, I can't believe it. I don't, I can't understand how you could leave the river with all of this. And I told her I was fished out. I'd caught a few fish. It was enough of a day for me. So I have had both. And I think now I miss it, but I feel that I have a very rich, coherent set of memories and have written about it so much that I'm never going to forget some of those memories now. I did write a lot about it, and I think being able to write gave me an extra joy in having done the thing, like your wonderful story, Bennett, about fishing with your son up at Echo Lake.
Oh, thank you.
It multiplies the pleasure of the moment itself. Your son will never be the same age. You probably never get a fish that size again.
I know I won't. Ruth has a hello, Ruth. Thank you. Ruth says Nick and Mary lived in I think it's Eastover in Byrdcliffe that she
We did. It was the second time we came back. The third time we came back, the kids were much older then. Paul was already in college because he was a runner by that time, and that's when he started. And some of them went to a summer camp. We had much more time. The kids were much more independent. We lived in Eastover for 2 summers. So we actually were there 5 summers in Byrdcliffe. Yes.
And Ruth, it's a beautiful photo of Nick on the in the dust jacket. Just great photography. Thanks for sharing that, and I'm so glad that they used it. Whoever published this.
Yeah.
Jared asks. Jared asks, says, thank you so much. Truly a story from the heart. I look forward to reading a copy. What is the next thing that you're working on?
Aha. It's also a good question. I usually work on 2 or 3 things at the same time. I have a book that I'd like to write that I have notes for called Love After Love, which is about finding Ruth, whom I had known very slenderly at Bard College 55, 60 years ago, and whom I met met again several times when Mary was alive. Mary knew her and liked her. At the Maverick, we both enjoyed the classical music, and I'm trying to do something on Mary. I have written several essays that have been published in Pennsylvania Gazette and elsewhere on some of the feelings of grief and what one does with it, and in one case, how you come out of it if you can. It's a very hard thing. I had thought to write a book about Mary, but I found a talk she once gave, which is more or less a painter's odyssey. It's about 15 or 16 pages. And then in her journals, I've recently found that very often, and I never knew about this, she had about 100 sketchbooks that I found. I've given some to Bard College, which has taken a few of her paintings. But I found a notebook just a few months ago that has what could be 40 or 50 pages in a book. And my theory is now to be an editor and to cobble together a book of Mary's journal entries, the one that pertain to art or to some issues that will further people's understanding of her and how she worked. And that talk she gave at Rider University on a painter's odyssey. It starts with her. She once won the Miss Elsie contest when she was 6 years old in Oakland, California, which won a box of crayons. And she was always fond of saying, I never won another award or applied for one in my life.
She was
I have that. And then I also may want to do an essay on Paul. I've taken notes for it. I don't know whether I will. His brother Charlie, who traveled with Paul a lot, they went to the Amazon together. and had an interesting relationship, not all peaches and cream. He may write something about him, and if he does, I probably will not. Um, I think of certain kinds of writing as what Sander Marai, the Hungarian writer, says, as keeping things from vanishing from our lives. And I would like certain things to remain. I think they've been interesting enough. Any others?
There's two more, and then I think we're almost done here. One is there a part of the book that was particularly difficult for you to write? If so, why? That's from Mary Yoshihara.
Then when what?
Was there a part of the book that was particularly difficult to write?
I think the one on my mother is the most difficult and probably the most interesting if one has the patience to go through it. It's quite long. I think it was about 40 or more typewritten pages. And it was an odd relationship. She was not a difficult woman. She was a kind woman and a woman who seemed to have a zest for life. But I think we started out badly because of this tragedy that she'd had, with a husband dying 3 months before I was born, and her thinking to a certain degree that she might have sent him out on a night when he was ill, in which he was coughing a lot, and he got his pneumonia struck, and there was no penicillin then, so he died. And I think it was a shocking, traumatic event in her life. I think when I got out of, I don't remember much before then. She was not there. She was working. I mostly knew my grandparents and my uncles when I lived in a big house. She was living there too, I assume, but I don't remember her. I remember her taking me to the boarding school, and I remember her leaving after she said she'd be there, and my uncle saying he'd be there, and they were not. And it's a thing that happens. The woman who ran the place knew how to deal with situations like that. And she gave me some toys. And when I found out they were gone, I went berserk and started screaming and hollering and acting poorly at 5 years old. But when I got out of the boarding school, when she remarried, from the beginning, there was a kind of tension with the new father. And this also brought attention because she was 100% loyal to him. And I felt that I was somehow not there. They had a child, my sister Amy, who died while I was talking to her on the telephone, if you want another horrible story. But
I was hoping that you would not. I was hoping you would save that one. That one is a great part of the book, Nick. I have to say that you write so beautifully about both death from a point of tragedy and from a point of absurdity, and that is really an excellent one. There's one last question here, and then I think we're at time, which is and just very quickly, do you have any ritual habits that for your writing regimen? That you can share
when I'm working on something, I am very compulsive about it. It's never, I always hear about writers who spend 4 hours, Henry James, Hemingway, a lot of others that you read in the Paris Review interviews with writers who have very defined habits. I always had a rather busy family, and I wrote when I could. And when I wrote compulsively. I would stay quite as long as I had to. And I still do that, I think. My life, even though it's quite simple now, still has a variety of appointments and whatnot, mostly medical now. But there's a German word, Sitzfleisch, which means sitting flesh. And I've always taken that to be, if it's a ritual, that's my ritual, to stay seated and stay there until I finished a coherent amount of work. So beyond that, I'm really rather maverick in it. I think I have no special one. I do write longhand on a lined paper first, and then I put it on a typewriter. I used typewriters until these crazy computers have come in, which I don't understand. But I used to work on an Underwood Standard all my life, and I triple space it, and I still do on Word, so that I have plenty of room to rewrite. And as an old editor, I do a lot of rewriting. And that's roughly it. Looks like.
Thank you so much, Nick. This has just been a wonderful hour. I think the people are just saying thank you so much, and how wonderful it is to hear from you. I'm just going to toss it back to Jackie and the folks at Byrdcliffe here. But thank you so much, Nick. This was I'm just so thrilled to be here.
It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it very, very much.
Nick and everyone, Nick, thank you so much. It was just so beautiful. Everyone, thank you for attending. Please support the Woodstock Byrdcliffe Guild, which is a beautiful institution in our community that's making this event possible this evening. Visit their website. All of these wonderful events, like Nick speaking this evening, is recorded and available on the website. And look at their calendar for all the other amazing events that they're doing. There's so many wonderful interviews with authors, artists, all sorts of folks around Woodstock. So everyone, thanks again and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you,
Good night.
Jackie. Thank you, Jackie, so much for having it, for being a wonderful, wonderful runner of a wonderful bookshop.
Oh, and by the way, you can buy Nick's book at the Golden Notebook. Anyway, thank you, Nick, and thanks everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you all. Hi, Ruth. Good.